Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of our series of Analyticahp online debates. We're a growing blog and news site created by a group of students, and we hope you'll enjoy our content. So without further ado, our debate concerns the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is going to be, we think, especially relevant in a post-coronavirus world, even though it hasn't been talked about much in the news. And so, without further ado, let's start the debate. So, this is Archie, and he will be arguing against the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is Yazhou, and he will be arguing in favor of the Belt and Road Initiative. All right. Archie, so why don't you introduce your position? What do you think about the Belt and Road Initiative?
Sure. So the Belt and Road Initiative, first to define it for those people who are watching and don't quite know what it is. It's a move by China to essentially grow their country and their military and their economy by expanding their trade networks and giving lots of donations to developing countries around the world, and then creating a sort of network of money and trade and then debt to China around the world, which will allow China to grow in the long term and to definitely expand its navy in particular to become a global force, which is particularly important in a world in which the US has had so much naval dominance for so long. In terms of the position of the opposing arguments, which I'm going to be representing in this debate, it is that, for a start, China is going to put lots and lots of developing countries that can't cope with it into very large debt. And a very good example of this is Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, both of which are countries that are not going to be able to recover in time for when they owe China the debt. And this is going to ruin the economies and then the lives of the people living there, and particularly the workforces, which will then lead to a spiral of inflation, and it will stop foreign investors from coming into the country. We also believe that China should not, as one entity, one country, have so much control over the rest of the world, and the rest of the world should not be this dependent upon China. And this is because we do not believe in the global economy being dependent upon the Chinese economy, especially because of the unreliability of food security and things like that in China, especially as its population is growing. And we also believe that it is unhealthy for the rest of the world, countries in the world, for their economies to be so dependent on China, because it will reduce their exports and therefore their GDP quite a lot.
All right, I'm going to get to you, Yazhou, soon. I've got a few questions to ask you. Now, you talk about it being a bad thing for the world to be dominated by the Chinese economy and China dominating the world, but isn't this sort of what the U.S. did in like a post-World War II environment since Woodrow Wilson? And where's the difference between China and the U.S.?
Well, firstly, I'd like to firstly say that the US did not take a move to put lots of developing countries under a large amount of debt, which would damage them in the long run. While the US did gain a very dominant position, which many would argue is a bad thing, was a bad thing, especially now. The difference between the US and China in terms of which one would have that dominant position, many would argue that the US, they would prefer the US having it because it is a much freer country, it's a much more open country. We have a much better idea. Here in Britain, for example, we have a much better idea of what's going on in America than we do as to what's going on in China. There are also lots of human rights abuses in China. And the US is sort of, it's one of the I mean, another debate is about its support of Saudi Arabia, but other than that, it leads the world in many on very moral aspects. And the opposition to this debate believes that the US, for those reasons, should we need to choose between two dominant countries. Obviously, in an ideal world, there would be no dominant country, but should we have to choose, the US will be chosen for those reasons.
All right, Yazhou now. All right. So we heard Archie put forward his position. Now let's ask Yazhou. So Yazhou, why do you think the Belt and Road Initiative is a good thing for developing countries?
Well, China is helping other countries. China is helping developing countries develop. And although Archie said that this puts them into a spiral of debt, but the thing is, if they don't manage to pay off their debt in time, as seen with some countries, China offers alternatives such as building military bases in their property
and
in the country.
But don't you think this is sort of a predator move by China to sort of take control of these developing countries by like taking their securities and collateral like military bases and establishing more of a wider influence?
Agreeing to this, so they are fine with it.
Right, but aren't they sort of being forced by having the debt?
Well, no, the debt comes from them agreeing to China helping them.
Right. So, Yazhou, although it helps countries develop, according to China, don't you think it's sort of a predator move by these sort of state-owned Chinese companies to give these loans and then basically take their collateral and securities, i.e. military bases, to establish a more wider Chinese influence in the Asia-Pacific and African region?
No, certainly not, because China is allowing these countries to. China is giving quite a free rein to these countries over what they're allowed to do with this money, and the countries have a choice whether to agree to this or not. And in most circumstances, they do, because it is a win-win situation.
Right. All right. What's your response to that, Archie?
Well, I think that, first of all, allowing countries such free rein on what they do with their loan, and this has already been evidenced by what's happened, gives greater room for human rights abuses in countries, workers being paid tiny amounts, living in terrible conditions, especially in the countries that are struggling the most. I also think that Yazhou has spoken a lot about how countries are agreeing to this, but what we are not mentioning is how corrupt the regimes of many developing countries are, and the fact that in the democracy that we strive for in the 21st century should be based upon the people, and that some politicians who are very corrupt and are thinking about themselves, which most politicians are guilty of, but most politicians are in democracies. Well, not most.
Accountable. You mean accountable?
Accountable to democracies, yes. And I think that allowing, and I think that negotiations between China and dictators, which we don't know what happens in these negotiations, are probably may well not be a representation of the people, especially because lots of the money has to be spent on companies that employ Chinese workers, which is not really helping the people of the developing countries, and what they really need is for the people to come out of the state they're in.
All right, I understand your point, but don't you find it a little ironic that you're sort of warding Africa and these sort of less developed countries against China, even though the West has been exploiting them for literally hundreds and hundreds of years?
The West, what the West did in Africa, and in Africa especially, and in the rest of the world, in South America, was not right. And I think that it applies just as much to those countries, to Britain and France and Spain and all of these countries, a couple of hundred of years ago, when this was happening in Africa and South America. But I think that what we need to be doing is striving towards a goal of people being satisfied, treated well enough, and basically human rights being fulfilled, and absolute poverty ended, more or less, because that is the aim of globalism in particular, and that's what China is using globalism to do this. And I think that and I think that what they did in Africa a couple of hundred years ago was not right at all.
Right, but predator multinational corporations from the West are still using the African countries as dumping grounds for like palm oil and things like.
Yes, they are, and that's not,
so in some sense, Western exploitation hasn't ended, right?
Yes, yeah, and it hasn't, and I think that's right. I think that that's wrong. Well, what you said is right, and what they're doing is wrong. But I think that while we are working towards, hopefully working towards, or beginning to work towards ending all of this in these countries, which is done by the West and is not right at all. Just because of your geographical location, it doesn't put you on some moral high ground. But I think that what we shouldn't then be doing is giving more room for this to happen all over again. I think that we are near to exiting this phase, and I think that we shouldn't let it begin again. All
right, Yazhou. So, what's your view on this sort of exploitation similarity? Like, people argue about China's exploitation and Western multinationals' exploitation. So which one do you think is more dangerous or not dangerous at all?
Well, but China isn't really exploiting the countries, because it's just helping them develop infrastructure. And, well, yes, it might be putting them into debt, but it's still helping them.
But do you not think that debt isn't helping them, given that all that debt does is cause inflation and ruin people's lives? And what's the point of helping a country if all you're going to do is make the people's lives worse?
Well, as I've said, there is an alternative. If the country does not manage to pay off their debt, they can allow China to set up a military base in there.
All right. So, fine. All right. So we've heard from Archie that he thinks that China's exploitation is worse than these Western companies doing it. But all right, let's hear from the opposing view now. Why do you think that China is inherently doing better things for these developing countries in Africa and Asia Pacific region rather than these Western countries?
The Western countries have been exploiting them, using them as dumping grounds for palm oil, as you said, and it doesn't really help the countries in the long term, but China is helping these countries to build infrastructure which will be good for them in the long run.
Yeah. So, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not purely economic, the consequences of it. It's also, as opponents and proponents argue, sort of a political discourse and problem, right? And sort of similar to the Cold War, if one looks at it. So, what do you guys think? Do you think that the Belt and Road Initiative is a sort of Chinese idea to further Chinese interests politically as well as economically, or simply a economic program to improve their trade?
Yeah,
I'll start with you, Archie.
if you don't mind, Yazhou, I'll go first. Well, I think that just like in the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, this is not just an economic move. Obviously, any superpower or superpower to be, that's China's goal in the long run, wants to have as much of the world as possible on its team, especially if there's a rival power in the world, in this case the United States. And I think that what China is doing is different from what the US was doing for a few reasons. The first of which is that the US and the Soviet Union in the more eastern side of the world, although I'm going to talk about the US because that is the power in question against China here. It was after World War II, which meant that lots of countries were in a not a very good position, and the US had come out of it as a superpower. I think that they did a mixture of different things, some of which were very good, some of which were very bad. If you look at Germany, what they did in West Germany and West Berlin was amazing. And
right, but of course, like,
there's no argument about that. But some of the dictatorships they set up in Argentina and places like that were just where they were horrible. And
of course, no one forgets the infamous General Pinochet in Chile, who was sort of one of the only examples of free market dictator.
And I think that there's no reason to be supporting the US's actions here as an attempt to oppose what China is doing. I'm totally for boosting the world economy, and I think China should be trying to do that. But I think that the main problem with this initiative is not the debt, but also the fact that it is supporting. It's not so much setting up. They're not getting directly involved in countries because no countries have that they're getting involved in have collapsed. But they are definitely supporting, at least in the short run, dictatorships around the world. But I think that, and I think that if China were to take a step forward and work towards helping these countries to try and come out of this dictatorship, I think that they could actually get more out of it from themselves, because they'd be in a more of a moral high ground, especially in things like the United Nations. And I think that they would, of course, they would have less control in these countries, and I think that is part of what they're trying to gain.
All right, what's your response? What is your response to that, Yazhou?
Well, it's not damaging the countries. It's China is trying to help those countries, and unlike the US, where the US government isn't actually getting involved in this anymore, but it's the US multinational corporations that are damaging the countries by setting up all these palm oil plantations and things.
Right, and of course they're also they have a big place in corrupt governments where they're these big multinational corporations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that rounds up our first debate, and thank you for listening in. Make sure you go to analyticahp.com. You can read all of our latest posts.
There will be a link in the description to the
watch all of our new videos. Create a free account so you can comment and chat with other members and view our subscription-only articles. And subscribe to our mailing list, and you'll get weekly emails telling you the newest posts on our website. We've got exciting new content every week. This is analyticahp.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.